If anyone has ever felt like they aren't quite as sharp as they used to be, well, that is because your brain is changing as you age. In this episode of Stark Naked Radio, Amir and I got to talk with Dr. Bob Schafer, who is the head of research at Lumosity. And he schooled us on how aging affects your brain. So if you have a hard time remembering where you left your car keys, then you will definitely want to listen to this episode.
Hey guys, this is Morgan, and today's episode is brought to you by Stark, located in Irvine and Newport, California. If you enjoy the podcast, subscribe, share, and give us a 5-star rating in iTunes. And don't forget, the 2019 Stark Naked Challenge is going to be live for voting on the 26th, so be sure to check out our website at www.starklife.us to vote.
Stark Naked Radio from Southern California, where we talk about
strategy,
butts,
goals, blood chemistry,
lifestyle,
IV therapy,
poop,
tips, digestion,
and
science
to help you
look better naked
and perform at your best.
What's up, everyone? It's another episode of Stark Naked Radio. I'm Tyler Mounce.
with Amir Mofidi.
We are here with Dr. Bob Schafer, who is the head of research at Lumos Labs. So many of you maybe have done the Lumosity program to try and train your brain. I know I've done that a little bit. I was experimenting on brain function a lot recently, but Lumosity is a pretty cool company that's doing a lot with cognitive performance, brain function, memory, things like that. So Dr. Schafer, it's great to have you on the show today.
Hey, thanks. Great to talk to you guys.
So we've been doing a series on aging. We've talked a lot about joints and aches and pains and hormones and slowing metabolism. But one thing, if you ask anybody, is that as you get older, stuff starts to happen to your brain. Things like memory, getting more, foggy, not as sharp or quick. A lot of that stuff is going on. So I was hoping maybe today, we'll start with a little bit of your background and how you got into doing what you're doing, but we'd love to talk today at some point about what is the stuff that's actually happening with your brain as it ages, and to what degree can you influence or prevent or slow that decline.
Sounds good. Yeah, really, really interesting topic.
Before we get into that topic, can we do a little bit of just to hear a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah, so I've been here at Lumosity for about 4.5 years. I'm actually I come from academia, so I was a lab neuroscientist for about 10 years. I was really interested in kind of the neural basis of attention. So attention is one of those things that, yes, it changes across ages, but attention is this complex process where your brain is actually able to flexibly allocate its resources. You know, it can choose to process one thing over another, and it's something that we take for granted, but it's really a fascinating, complex problem. And so my research in the lab was on how neurons in the brain actually allow us to do that flexible processing. And I started very much on the basic sciences side, so the neurobiology. So not working in clinics with patients, but really understanding at the level of individual neurons and circuits of neurons. But going from my lab work, I was really interested in ways that we could apply the science to the real world, and so that took me out of academia and into kind of the business world. I actually had a small startup of my own for a few years, and then my tiny team there joined Lumosity a few years ago. This is where I've been since then.
So you had a tiny team of people doing some stuff in this space, and then you guys joined up with the Lumosity crew to kind of expand into that?
Yeah, and actually, you guys might appreciate this. So my startup before Lumosity, really the goal was try to quantify all the different ways that people think and make decisions, and really try to take things that people often talk about as intangibles and see if we can have some standardized ways to measure those things. And so when you think about, let's say I'm making a decision under pressure, so it's under time pressure, or it's a gamble, it's a risky decision. Different people make those decisions in slightly different ways. And if you can get the ability to measure that, And now I can take your measurements and my measurements and how we're making those decisions differently. We can start to ask whether those differences between people actually matter in the real world. So do those differences correlate with the way we do our jobs at work, with athletic performance, with whether or not we're going to be ultra competitive or more lax when it comes to, let's say, I'm a competitive runner, competitive swimmer. So yeah, really trying to take that mental side of things, quantify it, and ask how these different mental traits correlate with things that matter in the real world.
And for those that aren't familiar with what Lumosity does in general, what's kind of the overarching mission for the company?
Yeah, so Lumosity is a brain training program. So the idea is it's kind of an analogy to a gym. We have a library of dozens of different games, and you can think of each game as kind of like a different machine or station at the gym. So each game is designed to target a different cognitive ability or mental ability. And so we have games that target memory or attention, flexibility, information processing speed, problem solving, things like that. We also have math games and language games. But the idea is that as you train on these games, you see improvements, not just on the games themselves, but then we can actually measure the way that training on these games impacts cognitive performance measured in other ways as well. And so, again, like a gym, we have it set up that in Lumosity, you come in each day and we have a recommended set of games for you. You get stats and feedback. You get insights that really take your performance and analyze it and help you link it to things in your life that you might care about. And so over time, you stick with it, again, much like you would with a gym. And we try to keep it mixed up for you, so we're always stretching you and challenging you in new and different ways.
So switching to the topic of aging, we've got Amir here who is centuries old, and then myself who's not quite so advanced in years. But even so, you notice it's pretty palpable the differences that happen in your brain as you age. Can you talk a little bit about what is actually going on? Like most people, myself included, we just experience the symptoms of it. But in terms of what's going on with your brain, like I remember the lyrics of songs I listened to in high school, but I can't remember the conversations I had last week sometimes. What's actually happening?
Yeah. No, this is fascinating stuff. So actually, I'll go back all the way to the beginning of life. So what happens in your brain, soon after you're born and as you're developing as a child. So you guys, I know on previous episodes, you have talked a bit about things like neuroplasticity and whether you can even create new neurons. And actually, when you're born, you start out with this very densely connected brain. So each neuron in the brain is actually connected kind of more than it would normally be connected for an adult. And you go through this process of selectively sort of pruning, getting rid of some of those connections. And so as you're developing as a child and adolescent, you're kind of pruning some of those connections. And by the time you're, late teen and then into your 20s, your brain is kind of getting to its mature state. And that doesn't mean that your brain stops being plastic. It doesn't mean that your brain can't do anything new. But at that point, the connectivity of your brain is, grossly speaking, it's about what it's going to be for yourself as an adult. Now, the ability of the brain to change and grow throughout life, even adults, as we know, can learn new things, but some of those capabilities of the rapid learning, the rapid growth, that declines. And my expertise really is now on the cognitive side. So you were talking about experiencing the symptoms, and that's really where my expertise is. So I'm excited to tell you about some of the stuff that we've learned from Lumosity, because we can really look across tens of millions of people and understand what those differences are as we look across ages. But one thing to call out is that we all should expect that our brains and our cognitive performance change as we age, and it's not something pathological. It's not that we have a disease. It's not that that the fact that your raw brain power starts to change. That's not related. I mean, that does not mean that you have dementia or anything like that. This is a natural part of aging, and so really understanding what is healthy aging when it comes to cognition, what is unhealthy aging. What are the differences that we expect to see and that we see across the board? What are things that are abnormal? That's a lot of what we're able to look at Lumosity, just again by being able to look at what's happening to tens of millions of people as they age.
So really quickly, so I understand this process with pruning the neural connections. So when you are younger, you have all of these connections available to you, even though you're not using all of them. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you can think of it as maybe as like fine tuning. If you started out with everything connected to everything, the good news is that anything is potential. You've got all of those circuits actually there, but you've also got a lot of noise in there. You're not going to be doing things very precisely because the signals are not just going to the targets that you want them to go to, but they're going to all kinds of other places as well. And so, yeah, again, the benefit of having this really dense connectivity is that you're sure that you can get a signal from one place to another, but it's not going to be very efficient. It's not going to be very clean or targeted. And so a lot of that pruning, the idea is that that you're dropping some of those connections that are not the right ones, that are not the ones that you want. And so after you've done a bunch of pruning, now again, pros and cons. So the pros are that your connections are much more efficient and targeted. The cons are that, well, you can't easily regrow that connection from one place to another place after you've dropped it. And so you're sort of in a different state where you've got more of that efficient targeted connectivity, but you don't have such dense connectivity.
So just so I understand, basically the reason a kid can pick up Spanish so easily is because all the circuits are there for them, even though they may not be efficient. There's more availability to develop these things. But then as you get older and the signaling becomes more efficient, you've also pruned back some of the stuff that makes bringing in new skills like learning new things like another language harder to do. So there's it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's just kind of how things shift.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's the hypothesis there, and I'm going to be the super conservative scientist here by saying, I have not. So we don't actually measure in a child who is learning a new language which connections have pruned and which ones have not. But the idea that early in life you've got these golden windows where kids can learn really rapidly. And the hypothesis there is that it really does have to do with the level of connectivity and kind of the rate of change of the connections within the brain.
Does your research go into personality at all? Because we will know that personality starts to develop as we age. So, and some of the things that are maybe perhaps less objective, like wisdom, starts to grow inversely to the connections, right? So is that something you just more like observe, or is that something that actually appears in your research?
Yeah, man. So my own research does not go into that. I heard a quote from someone recently that I really liked. So this was an older guy, and he said that he often talks to the young, whippersnappers who he comes up against and says, your brain might be moving faster. You might have more cycles per second, essentially, but I'm going to come up with the answer faster. And so that wisdom really does play in. I think wisdom, the way that you described it and the way that a lot of people think about it, that also comes from experience. And so if you separate out what is the raw, horsepower from what is all the stuff that I've learned over time, what is all the experience and how does that help me? both of those are valuable. You have a lot of the horsepower when you're younger, but you have a lot more experience when you're older. And so,
regarding that,
yeah.
is it better, or do you not know, or do not have opinion either way? Is it better to specialize in something as an interest or a hobby or a mode of education, and really develop strong connections in that thing? For example, violin, or is it better to learn 7 languages as quickly as you can and be more diverse and kind of spread your connections across a larger field?
Yeah, well, for me, that really depends on what it is that you want to be doing. I'm remembering. So I read something now a couple years ago. I wish I could point you to it exactly. But the idea was, at what age do people have their biggest breakthrough or their biggest masterpiece, depending on what field they're in? And it is this really fascinating thing where, so mathematicians, it's like if you haven't had your breakthrough by the time you're in your mid-20s, it's not looking good for you. Whereas novelists, so authors or great artists, it's not that uncommon for someone to have their first masterpiece when they're in their 40s, 50s, or beyond. And so this question of what should I be focusing on at what age, I think it really does depend on what field you're in, what field you're interested in.
Well, but my question is more: is it better for someone, as far as maximizing the connections they do have, or
gotcha.
they're going to have, is it better to specialize and kind of be narrow focused on a thing like the cello, or is it better to spread yourself across a variety of fields?
Gotcha. Yeah. Again, it probably depends a bit on what your goal is, but okay. I'm going to say, generally speaking, I recommend spreading across a variety of things. I think that one of the things that we see when people get older, especially when they are in the same job for many, many years, is they get into kind of a mental rut, right? So you end up doing the same mental operations over and over again. And then even worse, after you retire, you can very easily fall into a rut where you're not challenging yourself cognitively in the same ways that you used to. And there's been some really interesting research about how challenging someone's occupation is. So how challenging is someone's job, and how does that relate to the age at which they might start experiencing some more severe negative impacts of aging. And the idea is that if you've had a really challenging job, if you've had a really dynamic social life, typically, they talk about it as building up cognitive reserve. So you've kind of built up more of a buffer. So even as you get older, you don't have as many deficits until a later age. And so I think that embracing this idea of challenging yourself in lots of different ways, not just the same way over and over again, but really stretching yourself in many different ways mentally, I think that's definitely something I advise and that I recommend, well, to others, and that I try to also do myself.
Yeah. So obviously, if you want to be a world-renowned pianist, you need to practice the piano over and over again, and you're inevitably going to narrow down some of those connections, right?
Yeah.
But from an aging standpoint, if you think of the plasticity or the ability to take on new things in your old age, the more you spread yourself across a lot of different skills and kind of use and maintain some more connections, then you have more available to you as you age. Because, right, isn't the hypothesis that essentially you just lose connections as you age?
So yeah, there's definitely losing connections, and also some of that learning just occurs at a slower rate. And there's something that I really embrace, which is the idea of, it's kind of learning begets learning. So if you are learning, you're setting up your brain in a way that actually makes it better at learning. And so this is kind of a hypothesis that's supported by a bunch of research. So even in the lab, for years, people have known that even animals, if an animal is kept in an environment that's really enriched, so there are lots of places where the animal can be exploring and kind of playing with different items that are in the environment, they actually then learn faster on entirely separate tasks that they're trained on. And so this idea that if your brain is in a learning state, if you are keeping your environment enriched, if you're doing different things, it can actually set you up to be a more effective and efficient learner. And so I think doing some of that mental stretching, really challenging yourself in many different ways, probably sets you up to be able to learn faster at the things that you really want to be learning.
So here's a kind of a random one that I can only speak to anecdotally. So I'm a musician, a very mediocre one, but a musician nonetheless. and so like I've been learning music, like learning songs, learning lyrics, learning different things on the guitar since I was a kid. Like and I noticed this specifically when it comes to the memorization of lyrics. Like I know every word to Butterfly by Crazy Town. And, like these hundreds and hundreds of words in these like rap songs that I learned when I was like 14 years old.
Right.
But I'll learn a new song now. And if I don't play it regularly I'll have forgotten how to play it or sing the lyrics to the song within a month. Like what is actually going on where like I have this memory from when I'm a kid or this song that I knew that it seems like it's cemented in there forever, but then I can't add new ones to that to the same degree, at least not with the same amount of stickiness.
Yeah. Okay. So probably a few different things going on. One is that when you were a kid, you might have just had a lot more time on your hands. And so for some of those songs, you probably listened to them a lot and kind of hummed them and said them to yourself. And so part of it is probably just from the repetitions. But there is this question of like, what is the maximum number of things that I can learn and keep in my brain? Like, can my brain run out of room for new concepts, right?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the idea of the Halle Berry neuron?
No, but I want to know about it.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. So this was great research. So a few related papers. Okay, so this group has patients, so human patients who have epilepsy, and because they have epilepsy, the doctors have implanted electrodes into areas of their brain where you can record or electrically stimulate these areas of the brain and try to predict or improve their situation with epilepsy. But because they have electrodes in their brain, you can also do a lot of really interesting experiments by recording what's going on in the neurons. And so part of the brain where you essentially store concepts, so people, words, places, you have neurons that if I take the patient, they're sitting in the bed, I show them a picture of a person, this particular neuron that I'm recording might start firing. It gets really active. What's really cool is in this part of the brain, it's not just any person. So I mentioned the Halle Berry neuron. So in their paper, what they had done was they showed patients, photo after photo, lots of different people. And they had this example neuron that they were showing that was really responding whenever they showed a picture of Halle Berry. And it didn't matter, what the lighting was. So it wasn't just like the visual, what about the image? It was really the concept, like this is Halle Berry. They also found a Jennifer Aniston neuron, and they actually found that for this patient, when they showed a picture of Brad Pitt, who was with Jennifer Aniston at the time, like this neuron started firing a bit, and they showed the words Jennifer Aniston written out, and this neuron starts firing. So this neuron is the concept of Jennifer Aniston, or it is the concept of Halle Berry, which then you can do some back of the envelope math. And so I heard this researcher talk about this, and you say, okay, how many different neurons do I have in this part of my brain? How many different concepts is this single neuron responding to? And now I can start to do some math and figure out, okay, well, how many concepts can I be keeping in my brain all at once? And the answer, sorry, that was a long buildup to what the answer is. It's kind of depressing. It's like, I think he said back of the envelope, 60,000 different concepts in your head.
What?
And like, that's not that many, right?
Oh my gosh.
The idea that we do probably have limited capacity, and yeah,
I gotta dump the Crazy Town lyrics, because that is for sure occupying too much hard drive space. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I love this question of like, why do I remember some things really well earlier in life? Why do I not recall them as well now? Part of it could be that, that part of our brain we've occupied, or at least those neurons are also involved in the memory for some other concepts. So maybe it's not so clean. But again, there's probably lots of reasons. Also, just when we're kids, we can repeat things over and over again, or watch the same movie a bunch of times, or listen to the same music a bunch of times.
There's a lot of information out there, like from a parenting standpoint, about the kind of content you expose your children to.
Yeah.
Like in terms of what are they watching, what are they reading, what are they listening to? From your research, do you think, and just in terms of, should parents be concerned, not like in terms of like, are the shooter video games going to turn my kid into like a maniac, but more like, should you be concerned about the content you're taking in from us, like in terms of how it occupies the space?
I don't think so. I don't think that you need to worry about, filling it up. Okay. I think that it is interesting to think about how your brain would be like dropping some things, forgetting some things, and writing it over with more. But I don't think that it's like an idea that we shouldn't be learning too much early on just to save more space for later.
Well, and it's interesting. There was a doctor we worked with a little bit, and he said something about, he was like, forgot where he put something, and he goes, oh, I'm so forgetful because I don't have as much. He kind of referenced this idea that like remembering where your keys are becomes harder as you get older, just because there's more information rolling around up there.
That is super interesting. I don't know. I don't know whether, so I guess I'm trying to think of like the ideal way to test that, if you could. And really what you want to do is find people that somehow they've gone through their life. So they're at an older age, they've gone through their life and just not learned that much, and see whether they're better at learning new things because they've got more space. And that,
yeah, interesting.
I'm guessing you would not find that would be true. But actually,
if you could just summarize, like, so we've talked a lot about kind of like childhood development of the brain, but we're talking about aging, which is kind of like more on the decline side of things. Can you kind of summarize, like, other than is there anything other than pruning neural connections that happens to your brain as you age from a negative effect standpoint?
Yeah, So definitely overall brain volume. So the size of your brain starts to shrink a little bit at older ages, and so you can definitely, if you look at let's say a structural MRI of an older adult versus a younger one, you can see some structural differences, and so there are real changes there. I think it's an open question, though, about how directly those structural changes map on to the functional stuff, those symptoms that you described, just the things that you can feel that are working differently. And the reason why I say that, so you'd be surprised at how often you can take two people, let's say they're the same age, so two older adults, same age. You look at their structural MRI, and if you have them each take some cognitive assessments, so you have some functional measures, they're not going to line up in many cases. And so you might have someone who on the MRI, it looks like their brain is like shrunken and really not looking great, but they're performing just fine on the assessments, and maybe, and vice versa. And so plenty of things do happen to the structure of your brain as you age. but it's not the case that every single structural change just translates immediately to a functional change.
What's the deal with gray matter? We do a ton. We advocate for a lot of reasons for the practice of mindfulness meditation. Like there's a lot of positive health effects that are associated with that. Like both like cognitive effects and just physiological effects.
Yep.
But they talk about meditation having this effect on the gray matter in your brain, like either improving it or increasing it, or it shrinks over time. Like what's up with that, and what does that mean in terms of function?
Yeah. So gray matter versus white matter. So the idea is that in your brain you have, roughly 100 billion neurons, and neurons are just cells. They're specialized cells. But a cell has a cell body, and then for neurons, they've got these long projections, these axons, and these axons transmit information from the cell body to other neurons. And so the idea is that the gray matter is where all the cell bodies are living, and then the white matter is where these bundles of axons are passing through. So when we talk about gray matter, all it means is it's the part of the brain where those neuron cell bodies actually live. And the white matter is just the projections. The white matter is those super highways where all of these axons are going from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. Both are really important. Without the gray matter, you don't have the neuron cell body. Without the white matter, you wouldn't actually have a way for one neuron to be talking to another neuron in a different part of the brain.
Gotcha. So if you theoretically had a ton more gray matter without increasing white matter, it wouldn't necessarily create a lot of benefit because there's no connections.
I think that would be a reasonable assumption. You can't easily grow more cell bodies without having the connections. But yeah, I think the point is the right one, that you need both. You need to have both of those there. What is interesting is that as you age and also if you have various diseases or you can see specific impact on either the gray matter or the white matter. So in some cases, your gray matter, you have these layers of cell bodies. In some cases, the gray matter is shrinking. And so that layer of neuron cell bodies is just getting smaller and smaller. It's kind of shrinking away. In other cases, you have specific issues with the white matter. So it's more about those connections that are getting disrupted or deteriorating. And because both of those are important, it's not good to lose gray matter and it's not good to lose white matter, but you would end up having different types of effects.
Gotcha. Are you familiar at all with Dr. Dean Burnett and the concept, the stuff he's done with neurogenesis?
I don't think I am. I am familiar with neurogenesis, but not specifically with. Yeah.
So obviously we talked to Dr. Burnett a little bit, but I know this idea of neurogenesis is my understanding is a little bit controversial in terms of whether or not it's actually achievable, right? Like, can we actually create new neurons, or do you have any insight in terms of like what the deal with that is?
Yeah, right. So generally speaking, for a long time, it was thought that once you're an adult, you're not really growing new neurons. So you wouldn't have neurogenesis. More recently, though, over the last few decades, let's say, there's been a lot more research into adult neurogenesis, and it is pretty clear that in cases you can have even adults growing new neurons in certain parts of the brain. So I think. So this is not my area of expertise, but the olfactory bulb. So related to the sense of smell, it turns out you've got neurogenesis in the olfactory bulb, I think, and then hippocampus, which is talked about in terms of memory and spatial navigation. So in some areas, I think for me the bigger question is, you don't need to have neurogenesis in order to learn new things. And so I think a lot of focus gets put on neurogenesis itself, but even without growing new neurons, your brain can be plastic. Your brain can change the weights of its connections between different areas. It can actually change in very substantial ways. Every time you learn something new, what you're doing is changing the weights of these connections in whatever circuits you're using. It's not that you need to be growing new neurons to plug in there. And so I am interested in the concept of, I'm interested in neurogenesis. I'm interested in the research, although again, it's not my particular area of expertise. What I want to reinforce though, is that your brain can do amazing things and learn and change and grow, even if it's not actually creating new neurons.
Yeah.
And so that's a nice thing to keep in mind.
My understanding of the argument was like whether it's neuroplasticity or neurogenesis doesn't really matter as long as you're able to do it, right, or to learn new things and to do it. So, but it's just an interesting conversation. Or like the people that, but then also too the people that are claiming that neurogenesis is going on or advocating for certain things to stimulate more of it, and that kind of thing. So, in terms of your brain's changing as you age, in a lot of cases, not so favorably. But can we talk practically speaking about? Because obviously with Lumosity, you're heavily involved in the practice of impacting cognitive function. So can you talk about like sort of how you can prevent cognitive decline as you age?
Yeah. Well, so first let's talk about what actually is changing with age in terms of your mental abilities, your cognitive function. So this is an area that we've got a ton of data on, and it's pretty interesting. So in one case, so this is a paper we published a few years ago, but we gave about 60,000 people a big battery of cognitive assessments. So a bunch of different tests, and each test had its own area. So memory tests, attention tests, kind of an arithmetic reasoning, like a math test, bunch of different tests here, and we can look at performance for people of different ages. And the overall point is that the top scores came from people in their mid-20s, and pretty much all the way after your mid-20s, your general cognitive abilities as measured by this assessment, you're going downhill. So even when you're in your 30s, you're doing just fine. You're happy with the way your brain is working. It's still, it's already going down from your peak. But what's really interesting is your performance goes down at a different rate for those different cognitive functions. So when we look at things like working memory, the idea that I can hold these concepts in my memory and I can actually use them, I can modify them. Working memory capacity, attention, these things actually decline very rapidly with age. Whereas some other abilities like problem solving, so logical reasoning, also our math ones, so the arithmetic reasoning, these reasoning tests, they do decline, but not at quite as sharp a rate. And so you can see that there are different cognitive functions that are going to be really declining quickly as you get older. And then other ones that, you might have some modest declines, but they're not going to be dropping off in the same way as the others. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah. So like with Lumosity, you're creating these individualized brain training programs, and I'm assuming, is it factoring for those kinds of things? Like if it knows I'm in my 20s and 30s, it's going to more heavily train working memory versus problem solving or things like that, or is it as simple as that, as you train and address or prevent the ones that are going to decline more at certain ages of your life?
So we do this in a couple different ways. One is we do show you comparisons with other people your age, and so you can get a sense of where your performance in each of these areas ranks with other people who are also in their 20s or in their 30s or in their 40s. But then when it comes to the personalized training program, we really do it at the level of, so we take into account someone's strengths and weaknesses, not necessarily guessing by what age they are, but really just their performance as they've been doing the training.
Gotcha. What are some like big bang for your buck things to do to help with brain health and cognitive function as you age?
Yeah. So this is good. The list, unfortunately, is going to seem pretty boring and non-controversial. So the first one, physical exercise. So a lot of research showing that, especially for older adults, if you are physically inactive, you're going to tend to have worse cognitive performance. So physical activity is a great one. Keeping yourself cognitively engaged in many different ways. And so that goes back to what we were talking about before, just the idea that you can get in this mental rut, and instead of that, do what you need to do to stretch yourself in lots of different ways. So, if you look at the advice that comes from the Mayo Clinic, from, various different groups, one standard thing on there is keep yourself mentally engaged in lots of different ways. And I think that's a big place where Lumosity plugs in. Our goal is to have so many different types of games that are covering so many different cognitive abilities that we can give you a different set of games all the time and really keep you stretched in ways that you might not be going for otherwise.
Yeah, and sorry on that.
Yeah,
there's a book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, where she talks about growth mindset, fixed mindset, things like that, and I guess those, at least when you're talking about personal development, there's not as much of a it's not as physiological. But this, she's just talking about like from a character development standpoint, like if you know that you're not good at something, or if you're afraid of something, then you can kind of apply yourself to that thing, and then you can adopt this growth mindset, which will make you essentially a better person, or help from a character development standpoint. But on a very physiological level, what you're saying is the same thing, like applies to the brain. Like the more engaged you are with new things and taking on new tasks and stretching yourself, there's a component of this growth and fixed mindset that's actually occurring in your brain. Right.
And actually, I love that you bring up Carol Dweck. I think the research around growth mindset is really interesting and very much complementary with all of these other things that you might be doing to improve or maintain your cognitive performance. So the idea that thinking of cognitive abilities, mental abilities, thinking of those as things that can change, actually in her research leads to bigger changes in those very things. And so, yeah, I think having some of the mindset supporting the other types of improvements that you're trying to make, that can be a really effective thing.
What about what about facing fears? You have any research on like doing things that you're like, you think about people going and taking like public speaking courses or going skydiving or kind of overcoming their fears? Anything from a brain standpoint that you know about with that?
That's a great question. I will speculate a little bit. I have not done research on this, but I would think of this in the same general area as what I was describing as the enriched environment, the idea that learning begets learning. So if I put myself into an environment where I am curious and I am learning new things, that could actually set up my brain to be better at learning. And so I would think of that in the same general way. So if I have more novel things, more new things to me in my environment. So if I go skydiving and I never have before, if I try to learn a new language, if I visit a new place, even if I just take a different route home from work, all of those ways to sort of stretch myself and keep me learning and curious, I think there is power to that. And that could set you up to be kind of a better learner.
Any other big, like kind of like bang for your buck or low hanging fruits from a brain health standpoint as you age?
There was a study called the FINGER study. FINGER is an acronym. It's something like Finnish. I don't remember the rest of the letters there, but it was this big Scandinavian study on aging, and they combined, I believe, physical exercise, also diet, so healthy diet, and general mental stimulation, and so putting those three things together, I think that's a very powerful combination. That's a generally healthy thing to advise. There's been research more recently on hypertension and how that impacts or how that's related to cognitive decline. So I think keeping your body and keeping your body physiology in a good state is always going to be helpful for mental abilities as well. But yeah, I mean, not a shocker here, but staying physically active, keeping yourself mentally stimulated, having a good healthy diet, having a good healthy body, those are going to be some of the big tricks here. Well,
that works because we're in on that.
Yeah.
Amir, anything before we wrap up?
No, this has been great.
Yeah, this is awesome. If we talk with a lot of people about different things, but I think your perspective as like a scientist and a researcher is fascinating, and you obviously know a lot about the brain. In terms of people who want to learn more, like from a resources standpoint, any places you can point people?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Lumosity, I've really been hoping that we can do more summaries and descriptions of some of these areas and make them available, but unfortunately we haven't a lot yet. We do have research papers that are available, but that can be pretty dry if what you're looking for is the summary and advice. I find that looking at some of the big, Mayo Clinic website, some of the other well-respected medical or clinical institutions have some pretty good content, pretty good advice on ways to stay healthy with aging, and so I would definitely recommend checking that out.
Awesome, and then obviously Lumosity, like the program, right, is a good place for people to start.
Definitely. So Lumosity, I think, is a fun way to keep yourself engaged and stretched in all those ways. And we do have things like a fit test and a neurocognitive performance test where you can actually also take some measurements and kind of understand where you're at. And I think that's always helpful to kind of understand where you are and have that ability to look at what's going on with your mental abilities.
Yeah, I mean, and for anyone who listened to the episode a few weeks back where we talked about the experiment I did on brain performance on myself with the different nutritional and supplement things we were doing, the fit test from Lumosity was actually one of the tools I used to assess and quantify the cognitive function stuff. So
I heard that. Yeah.
So I actually, what I did is I essentially created two accounts. One I used to do a fit test pre, and one I used to do a post test. So anyways, yeah. So Lumosity, it's a very, very cool program, and the gamified aspect of it is awesome. So, Dr. Schafer, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate all the insight you shared, and it's definitely some good stuff. And it's nice to know that the stuff we're doing on the health and fitness side of things is tying into brain health nicely with regards to exercise and nutrition and lifestyle. So thank you again, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thanks, guys. Great to talk to you.
Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you're looking for more content, be sure to visit our website and social media, both at Stark.Life.us.